Hey everybody, welcome to Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. We're coming to you as always courtesy of our broadcasting partner, moretalk.tv. And this week on our show, we are featuring a presentation from the archives with Gladys Davis Turner. And in 1923, Edgar Cayce hired Gladys as a stenographer to document all of his psychic readings, and she also served as the recorder of the readings until Cayce's death until 1945. She not only shouldered the responsibility of writing down in shorthand every word Mr. Cayce uttered in the over 14,000 readings he gave during that period, but she also ensured their preservation and proper use by those who would read them in the generations of seekers who followed. In addition to taking down the readings, she transcribed them over 100,000 pages, initially on a manual typewriter twice. For this interview in particular, Gladys Davis Turner shares examples of Edgar Cayce's ESP while she was working with him. And this particular interview was recorded in 1974. I hope everyone enjoys our presentation from the archives with Gladys Davis Turner.
Today we are talking again with Gladys Davis Turner, who from 1923 through 1945 was Edgar Cayce's secretary. She stenographically recorded the vast majority of the psychic information which poured through Edgar Cayce in his unconscious states. Today we'll be beginning our discussion on the variety of ESP abilities, both consciously and in the state of the readings, the variety of reaches, as Dr. J.B. Ryan called it, the reaches of the mind. Edgar Cayce, both consciously and in the trance state, covered a bewildering variety of this kind of ESP, and no one that I know of is better able or better in a better position to talk about it than Gladys. Gladys, let's begin with Dad at the conscious level. Not much has been written about him, and I'm going to sort of add a story or two as we go along to put it together. But as you remember, Dad, through the years, how much telepathy did he have at the conscious level, in your opinion? And could you give us an example or two of this telepathic ability that he showed while he was awake?
Well, I had many experiences with him myself in that direction. He many times consciously read my mind, and it was wonderful if I was in accord with him when he read
thinking the right thing.
Yes, thinking the right things when he read my mind. But on several occasions he read my mind, and he reprimanded me, and I knew he was reading my mind, because otherwise he wouldn't have spoken to me like that. And I had my little nephew who lived with us one whole summer. He was telling me the other day, he's in his late 30s now, that he remembers Mr. Cayce reading his mind, and you reminded me of it when you said he knew you'd been swimming. He said that Mr. Cayce knew when he was telling the truth and when he wasn't. There were just so many examples. I don't know. I saw him do it with other people too, and there are thousands of index cards over there on clairvoyance, EC, conscious. Mm-hmm. So that they are a lot of them are listed.
Mm-hmm. They just haven't been written about.
Right,
that's the
right,
point. They haven't been put together in a form. I think, guys, you've heard me tell it on many occasions. Fortunately, there were no witnesses to this, because it would have blown their minds just as it did mine. I think the most unusual telepathy, clairvoyance that I ran into Dad with personally was in connection with the bridge thing. I had an awful time with that. I used to get him to, I began to love to play bridge, and I began to ask him to play bridge. And one day I caught him at lunch after lunch, and he came in just to rest for a few minutes. And I was sitting at a bridge table, and they dealt 4 bridge hands out. And I said, Dad, why don't you like to play bridge? Now, you play all these other games, and, you know, pitch and rook and pachisa and crokinole, all the games you love to play.
500.
500, yeah, all of them. Why don't you like to play bridge? He said, well, he said, you know, bridge, you have to concentrate so hard that it's very easy to read your mind when you're playing bridge. And I said, well, now, come on, you're pretty good when you're asleep, but when you're awake, I've never seen you do this kind of thing very often. And I can't imagine. You know, you're saying you read your mind at a conscious level? He said, yeah. And he got mad. It irritated him that I was doubting him. And he said, pick up that hand in front of you. And he said it just like that. Pick up that hand. And I tried to placate him and slow him down. I said, oh, now forget about it. It's all right. Just forget about it. He said, pick up the hand. And I don't arrange it. Just spread it out. Look at it. And he looked at it. I looked at it. And he started calling it and correctly called 13 cards right across. Got up and snorted and walked out. Said, that's the reason I don't like to play bridge. You know, I never asked him again. He was remarkable in a bewildering variety of ways. Gladys, did you ever see him with anybody else? You'd mentioned T.J., but did you ever see him with somebody where he was reading the mind? Did you remember?
Yes. I witnessed that experience that Eula Allen tells about, how she came in one day and he said she had a red aura, you know, and she was... you know, and he didn't want to talk with her and went back in the office and wouldn't talk. And she said she was just seething mad that day, and he picked it up. He knew that she was angry, and he didn't want to talk to her.
At this conscious level, you remember, Gladys, that Dad told many stories about his awareness of people who had passed on. What for you was the most dramatic of his conscious experiences in this area?
Well, I think one of them was his experience with his friend, Mr. Warwick, who had died about 3 years before this thing happened. And they had talked about death and had agreed that they would try to communicate with one another, whichever one went first. And he didn't hear anything from him for about 3 years. And then one night he was listening to the radio. He watched the Seth Parker program that came on.
You mean listened? He didn't watch.
Listened, right, but listened. And they would sing songs, and it was up in Maine, I think. He liked that program. And they were just down-to-earth people on it, and characters. And they were ending the program by singing a Sweet Hour of Prayer. And he was conscious, or he was in the room by himself, in the living room. Everybody else had gone to bed. And all of a sudden he felt that somebody was in the room, and he glanced up, and across from him in the chair was sitting Mr. Warwick, listening to the TV also, the radio. And he looked up and he said, that's it, Cayce. There is the survival of personality, and that's the only life to live of prayer and service. And he disappeared. And Mr. Cayce said he felt chills going up and down his spine. And he got up and turned the radio off and started out of the room, and he was conscious of just, it seemed like hundreds of voices in the room, all just talking at once, everybody talking at once. And he went upstairs to bed, and he was just so chilled, and he woke Mrs. Cayce, didn't intend to, but he was just so cold and chilled and getting in bed and covering up that she woke up, and she said, Edgar, you forgot to turn the radio off. And he said, oh, I did. Go back to sleep. And she got up and No, he got up and went to the door to, to make sure that that he had turned it off, and they both could still hear the voices down, from downstairs. So with the door open to the bedroom. So she was convinced that they did. There was another experience like that when I heard the voices too. When I was working late, and and I heard him talking to, someone down there heard the voices and didn't know anything about it.
I have the feeling, Gladys, and I don't know whether you agree with me here or not, that Dad saw and heard a great deal more than he ever told us about or talked with us about. I remember, and I will sketch it briefly, and you can add any part to it that you like. As I remember the story, and I hope I remember it the way you do, my grandfather died while he was living with us, and he went on a visit to my aunts in Hopkinsville. While he was there, he was taken ill and died. And Dad went back for the funeral and then came back home, and about 10 days or a few days after the burial in Hopkinsville, my grandfather showed up in our house. Now, he had a room that we hadn't moved anything. He hadn't planned to be away very long, and he hadn't taken a lot of his papers and things with him. And as I remember, what kept going on was a walking, like a shuffling, really not exactly steps, but a walking and a noise and a movement of things coming out of that room. And we would all be sitting down at lunch and or breakfast, and I kept running upstairs trying to find out what was going on in that room. And on one occasion, Dad told me, he said, quit worrying about that, quit thinking about it. Your grandfather's here. He's going to just be here a few days, and then he's going on. He's just straightening things around. It sounded wild to me, and I was still very skeptical and questioning. And so one day at luncheon, we were all sitting there, and everybody heard this. My brother heard it, Gladys heard it, I think, and my mother heard it, Dad heard it, the people that came in. The postman heard it one day. It scared the daylights out of him. He delivered the mail outside for a while. But I couldn't believe I heard this noise going on in the room while we were all sitting there. There wasn't anyone else in the house. And I got up and started upstairs. And Dad said, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And I raced upstairs as fast as I could. I didn't get to the room. I ran into Mr. L.B., my grandfather, on the landing of the steps. And it was exactly like running into a cobweb if you've ever walked at night in the woods and felt it. It was around you. He was around. I knew this was who it was, and I'm absolutely convinced, so I couldn't prove it, that every hair on my body, not only the head, but every one of them stood straight up in the air in broad daylight. It scared the daylights out of me. It was very strange. Now, do you remember hearing those noises and those things that were going on?
I also remember the Boy Scout that heard him breathing in there one night. You remember that time when you had the Boy Scouts in and they were hiding or something? They were playing games.
They ran into him.
And the Mr. L.B. had asthma, and he did breathe heavily. And he heard this man breathing in there, heard somebody breathing in the room.
He never did come back after that. We had a strange, it was like really with Dad, like having a telescope or a microscope in the living room. And you kind of looked through it, and everything you thought you saw before changed, and you saw a new world, a completely different level of dimensions and so forth. This whole business of conscious perception was something that Dad, as I remember, did a great deal of, and I'm certain that he had an ability with, I don't know that this is real psychic perception, but he had a green thumb that wouldn't stop.
Oh, absolutely.
I have seen him grow things that always The blackberries, he'd take them out of a patch out of little blackberries on the wild ones and start cultivating them, and he got there and talked to them a bit, and the things, the next time they bloomed, they would be the biggest blackberries you ever laid your eyes on. The asparagus was always first and best in Virginia Beach. He had amazing. Anything that he talked to and worked with, he seemed to have a rapport with nature. The people, you remember that strange tree that he had, Gladys, could you tell about that? It was funny. It's not a psychic ability, but it's an odd little thing about him.
You mean the tree that he sat under?
No, the one that he pulled around.
Yes, when he went fishing.
Yeah.
Well, he had this fishing pier, which he built, and jutting out into the lake, and he rigged up this old car seat that was cushiony, you know, and he had a comfortable seat sitting out there, but the sun got too hot for him, even though he'd wear a hat, and he planted a willow tree, a weeping willow tree, in a box that he fitted up with dirt in it, a great big box. It was wider than this table is wide, and planted this weeping willow and had it on a big rope that he could pull it out to the pier and when he wanted it, you know, and put it in the right place, and then he would pull it back to shore when he didn't need it. And we have some pictures of that. You can see it.
Floating, a tree floating in the water, moving it around to sit under. Not psychic, but very interesting. That tree grew beautifully, just magnificent, as if it had all the dirt in the world to grow in.
You were talking about his ability to see things, so many things he didn't even talk about, but you remember he used to say that he saw so much that he didn't want to see, that he had to consciously turn it off. Yeah. Even walking down the street, he would see things around people and forms and all kinds of
Did you ever
thoughts.
See him pick up things about rooms? You know, I was with him once in the McAlpin Hotel in New York when we were assigned to a room. And we went up and he started through the door. The bellboy was all the way in with the bags. And he stopped right at the threshold of the door and said, "I can't stay in this room." And turned right around, walked back downstairs, and we had to get another room. We had to find another room. I kept after him. What did he see? What was going on there? He said, "Well, no need to talk about that. The things that were going on in there, I just couldn't live with. I couldn't stay with, and I just didn't want to stay there with."
Well, the little oral booklet, you know, has the example of him starting up this elevator. He was waiting for the elevator, and he saw this gray cloud or something in the elevator, and he wouldn't get on the elevator, and it
was
crashed.
an accident with it.
Yeah.
Yes. He pulled, I think, one of the most amazing telepathic and clairvoyant stunts I've ever seen him do, Gladys. And you've heard me tell this too in the Willard Hotel in Washington. We were going in there one day for breakfast, and into the coffee shop, and this lady was standing in the door to the Willard at the coffee shop, pulling on some white gloves. And he walked on past her, walked into the coffee shop, turned around, walked right back out again. And I was behind him, and I didn't turn around. I knew what was happening. He went right back out and stopped right in front of her and said, "Madam, if I were you, I wouldn't get in an automobile for the next 24 hours. And her mouth dropped open, and she stopped doing her gloves, and he walked on in, turned around, walked on in. Now, I couldn't get him to tell me what he saw. He just refused to, let's don't talk about it. Don't want to talk about it, won't discuss it. Well, we finished breakfast, went along. The next morning, we went down for breakfast again, and we were sitting eating, and I saw this woman suddenly coming through the door, and she was hysterical. She was crying, and she was looking wild, starry-eyed all over the place, looking. I knew she was looking for him, and she came rushing across to the table, and I got up, tried to stop her, and she brushed me aside, just like I wasn't there, and said, grabbed a hold of him, caught a hold of him. He didn't even get up, and said, "I want to thank you, I want to thank you." And she had a crumpled telegram in her hand. And this woman had been asked as the story finally came out, she was very coherent, was crying, sobbing. Within an hour after we had seen her the day before, she had been asked by her sister-in-law to go on a drive down the Skyline Drive with her. And on the strength of Dad's comment, she had said no. And the telegram that she had gotten later that day, there had been an accident on the Skyline Drive. This woman had gone off the drive. The car had been demolished. The woman hadn't been hurt too bad, but the woman she had got to go with her had had her hip broken. And, you know, he was just seeing ahead there, looking ahead. Did you run into precognitive things within Gladys? Do you remember precognitive things that he had?
Yes, I know he did have many of those. I just can't think right now. I've got them all listed in there
of a particular
on the index.
experience.
You didn't give me time to look up some of those
I
examples.
know I didn't. What about, Gladys, what about other conscious abilities that Dad had? The communication with people who'd passed on, the telepathy, the clairvoyance, the precognition, any retrocognition that you remember?
Well, in the reading, certainly. I had
consciously again.
Consciously.
We can still stick to it. Or would you call the dreams that were retrocognitive that he remembered consciously? This would be
yes, I think so too. The dreams, and also in the physical readings where he mentioned the accidents people had that caused a spinal condition.
You mean seeing these consciously?
Well, no, I'm talking about the readings. The readings. Well, in the auras, I guess the aura reading, he probably picked up.
Do you remember
things from
any
the past.
examples of the picking up, retrocognitively picking up things out of the past with people?
You mean in the reading the auras?
No, not in the reading the auras, or in just consciously.
Well, I've heard him talk to people and tell them things about themselves. Whether he was, tell them, you know, whether he got, I don't know how he got it, but he, without even giving a reading, I mean, he would tell them things that
that had happened to
them. That had happened to them in the past.
Good. Let's move to the readings themselves, because this is the area that people know the most about, and of course there's a bewildering variety of ESP in the readings themselves. Every diagnosis, every physical diagnosis was a clairvoyant telepathy, where he was accurate about the physical condition of the body. Now, I've used a lot of these in lecturing and talking. What would, in your mind, stand out as a good example of the telepathic clairvoyance in the readings, where unusual accuracy was involved in a reading? Things that could be checked that were unusual.
Like the times when he commented on condition of the room, or for instance, like that time when he mentioned at the beginning of a reading, nice-looking pajamas. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that be one of the examples?
Well, that's an example of the clairvoyance or telepathy that was around the man, because we found out later, you remember, that the man had made this appointment as his apartment in Washington. He'd stopped by on the way home and bought a pair of bright red pajamas. And he'd gone home and put them on and lay down on the living room floor with his back up, because it was back that was hurting him, hoping that Dad could see, and with the pajamas would attract him. So he comments on these red pajamas.
Which we didn't know about.
We had no idea about it.
Until after Mr. Cayce died, when we were trying to get reports in on some of these things, and the man wrote and explained it.
Explained the red pajamas that he'd gotten.
Yeah. And the time when you mentioning the bridge made me think of this time when Mr. Harry Getz tells this story about this man who, in England, who had, Mr. Getz had influenced him to get a reading, to have an appointment for a reading, and he was over there in England, and he agreed to sit with him while he had the appointment, to make sure he stayed put in the hotel room or wherever it was for that time.
He was in London at the time.
Yeah, in London, yeah. And so they were sitting there. We didn't know this until later, but when the reading started, it said, good hand. And we had no idea what it meant. But later, as this Mr. Getz said, they were playing bridge, and he did have
a very good hand. You made a note on the exact time the reading started. And when they got it, he had been playing a grand slam at clubs. And now, I told that story on the David Frost show, and Frost threw up his hands. He said, this is hard to believe. This is just hard to believe. And Getz wrote to David Frost, and he happened to know it, and confirmed that story that I told, and Frost admitted it to me later on another show.
He was a witness of it.
He was a witness. He was there. He saw this happen. This reach of the beginning of the reading. What about a reading of a diagnosis, Gladys, of an example of an internal unusual diagnosis? Could you pick out one? There are thousands of them, of course.
Like the man that had, they thought he had appendicitis, and he had a surgery for had the appendix out, but he still had the trouble, and he was just in very bad shape. And the family, a member of the family, got the reading for him, and it said that this was something that it was caused from being hurting himself on years ago in a hard object being jutted into his side, into the intestines. And later he confirmed that he had been injured by a plow handle when he was in the field plowing. Mm-hmm. And he had this enteritis, inflammation of the intestines, and he was one of our prize cases right here in Norfolk.
Now that is a case of, as I see it, of both retrocognition, picking up something out of his unconscious mind that had happened to him at an earlier date, but the condition that Dad described continued to exist in his body, and he was picking this up telepathically, clairvoyantly, but he was going back to the cause of it back at that particular time. Of course, the famous case of that kind that you were witness to also, that has been written up, the man on the steps of the New York post office.
Oh, yes, he slipped on ice.
Slipped on. Yeah. And Dad looked back into a time when he had had the accident, injured a particular vertebra, and mentioned that vertebra. Now, the man had ended up, as a result of this, in a mental institution, and they got him out by correcting osteopathically the vertebra in the lower part of his spine at exactly the area. They x-rayed it and found it exactly in the spine, as Dad had described it, and then corrected it, and he got all right. These details of the diagnoses are just terrific.
That particular case was present. This man was present at a lecture in New York when it was called Five Doctors and a Psychic. And he got up, and when the doctor reported on his case, and he stood up in the back of the room and said, "I am that man."
You know, when he marched forward to shake hands with Dad, I didn't know whether to stop him or not. And he was a pretty big man to try to stop, and I was trying to keep that meeting going. I didn't know whether it was going to come apart at that point or not. Gladys, in the readings themselves, you saw a lot of the examples, more than I did really, of the Dad giving a reading for somebody who had requested it, but the request hadn't gotten to us. Now, do you remember, could you give us an example of one or two of those?
Yes.
They're very unusual.
Yes, this was in 1924, and we were in, it was probably in 1925, early in 1925. We were in New York, and a reading was Mr. Cayce was giving a reading before a group of people, and Morton Blumenthal had just become interested, and he had, there were several spiritualists there, and anyway, it was a physical diagnosis, and for one of the persons, I think it was the woman in whose home we were staying. Anyway, at the end of this reading, he started in on another person. He says, "Now we have Clara Inlow of so-and-so, Missouri. We find that he was saying that she should go and have
an operation.
Have an operation, to have the surgery. It was important for her to have this surgery. And I didn't have the name, the address or anything, I mean the detailed address, and so I wrote it off and had to wait. We were leaving the next day for Dayton, and when we got to Dayton, I put it in the envelope and mailed it to her. There was a letter waiting for us there asking for the reading.
And she was asking the question, as I remember, should I have an operation?
Yeah, she didn't know. She wasn't. The doctors had advised it, but she wasn't. She didn't know whether it was right. She wanted him to, Mr. Cayce, to tell her in the reading, and then she would have confidence to go ahead with.
So he had picked this up at a distance. There were lots of examples of that through the years. You remember, you and I were present in the Kahn home in New York on one occasion, where he gave 2 or 3 readings, voluntary readings, that the letters were in the mail. And didn't arrive until we got back to Virginia Beach. In that case, the requests for readings were in the mail, and Dad gave the readings before the letters got to us, calling the names and picking them up. I think one of the most remarkable, you were taking the reading, I understand, I don't know though for sure because I wasn't here, on Ruth Lenore's daughter.
Oh yes, I was.
Now, Ruth had called, if you remember, and I'd like to get a confirmation.
The reading had started, that was when Harmon Brough was here in that last year of Edgar Cayce's life, and we had already started into the reading, and we were giving a group of check readings. In other words, we'd had these people before, and we were giving check readings and to follow up. And Harmon answered the phone, and it was Ruth Lenore in Charlottesville, Virginia. No, she was.
Yes, she was.
Yes, she was in Charlottesville, Virginia, and her daughter was in Williamsburg, going to William and Mary, and the daughter had this accident, and she wanted Mr. Cayce to give a reading, and Harmon said, "Well, I don't know. He's already started with the reading, but maybe he'll give it this afternoon." And we'll see if whether he can do it or not. Since this is an emergency, maybe he will. And so this group of check readings went right on to the end of them, and at the end of it, it says, "Now we have before us Jean Lenore," and answered the question.
And gave a description of Jean. We're confirming a tape I did with Ruth here, but gave a description of Jean's fall from a double bunk bed. And the spinal injury that wasn't serious. And Harmon had never entered the room.
No.
He had never come in and given the request to Edgar Cayce or to you or to anybody. He'd stayed out.
Well, even if he had, it would still be. You wouldn't give it to him.
I know, but it's more interesting that it picked up from Ruth's request to somebody that Dad didn't even have, or there wasn't any request for, except in her mind, and then picked up 2 doors away by Harmon on the phone. The reach of this man's perception in those readings was amazing.
What was that time he said right out in the reading that you better close the window, it's going to rain, or something like that? Do you remember that one? It's sort of vague in my mind, but it just poured rain.
It was about to rain, and go shut the window. It's about to rain. Now, of course, that you could get rid of by saying he was more aware in the.
But he had his eyes closed. How could he tell?
I know.
And the time he saw the telegram come into the door, and we said, "Go answer the door before the bell rang." I mean, that was at the beginning of a reading too.
A little pickup. Reach. They're amazing gentlemen in this sense. What about the communication in the readings with people who had passed on, Gladys? There are a few examples, not many, and as I explained earlier to this audience before the taping began, there were times when he seemed to pick up a one-sided conversation with somebody who had passed on and was on some level. Could you give us an example of that?
Well, I remember once we were getting a reading. This was a reading that was volunteered too. It wasn't requested, and it came at the end of a reading. I think a reading on the work itself, we have about 115 readings on the work where we would ask questions about the work. Anyway, at the end of one of these readings, he started speaking again after the suggestion had been given to wake him up, and it said, "Here, sister, this is the way it is," and it was apparently talking to Mrs. Cayce, explaining to her how the readings were given, or what the remember that?
Was this Dr. Gay?
Dr. Gay,
Dr. Gay.
From Selma, Alabama, who had. He said, "This is Gay" at the end of the reading. This is Gay at the end of the message.
Now, in these instances, as I remember, Gladys, Dad's voice never changed.
No,
it was as if he were listening to and then repeating what somebody was saying from another level. Do you remember that crazy instance in Virginia Beach? Now, I remember this very well, and I don't know whether you knew about the man dying, but he was giving a reading for someone in Selma, and it was near the place where we had heard, when we were living in Selma, this old gentleman who was on the stock market.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes. He had strange, Arthur Fanistock, I think his name was. It's the reading, this reading, after we came to Virginia Beach, at the end of it, the statement was made, Arthur Fanistock has just come to the realization that he's passed
that he's
that he's dead. It's passed on. Yes. And it had been about 15 years before, and Mr. Cayce said that this man lived right across the street from the studio, and
we heard him die.
They heard him die.
We heard him die.
He was
screaming,
acute indigestion or something.
They had to bring the ladder. The door was locked, and he was very scared of things, and he had big double doors, and they couldn't knock the door down to get to him. They got the fire company and put a ladder up so they could before they could get to him. He died.
Well, he had been mentioned in a reading before too. I remember they said that the suggestion had been given for 23.5 Broad Street, I think, which was the address of the studio.
Yeah.
It was a reading for Edgar Cayce himself. This was interesting, and they had to give his name just like an address, just like anybody else when he had a reading. And whoever was conducting the reading, I think Mr. L.B. in that case, had given 23 Broad Street, or 20, anyway, whatever. Wrong number. And which was the building this man was in, and the reading said, we don't have him, but we see a man here. Mr. L.B. must have asked a question. It was said, "There's a man here, but and he's doctoring his books." But that was an interesting thing to have beforehand, because evidently with that type of mind, he was just not prepared for dying.
He didn't want to die, didn't expect to die, and didn't believe he was going to live after he died, and it was a great surprise to him to come to and realize he was dead 15 years after he died. We need to be careful about this. Gladys, do you remember that instance of the Dad's giving the reading in which, while we were on the trip, the boys and I were on a trip. I had my brother on this long scout trip, and we were camping, and he apparently stopped and talked to his mother. And she talked to her. Do you remember that incident?
Yes.
This is my grandmother who had passed on, and she hadn't been dead very long. And my brother and I, with several other scouts, were on a trip, and nobody knew, not even us, where we were going to camp every night. And she apparently came through after a reading in the same way. Do you remember that? And told where we were, what camp we were in, and that we were all right.
Yes,
and,
we have a copy of that.
Yeah.
That's really something.
He accurately mentioned the camp that we were in, and that everybody was well, though one of them, and mentioned by name, had been a little sick, but he was all right now. This was just picking it up from seemingly nowhere, because the family did not know where we were, and they certainly didn't know where we were going to camp. and we didn't know ourselves, and this boy had been sick. Now, this reminded me of a very interesting kind of precognition in the readings, and you will remember this, I'm sure. When I went on that trip, I had a reading from Dad, and I asked about all these boys, and he said one of them was going to get sick in Nevada over the alkali in the water.
Gave the name of the boy.
Yeah, he gave the particular name of the boy, and gave a prescription that he said, when he gets sick, give him 3 teaspoonsful of this and he'll be all right. So I had this stuff made up before I left on the trip. I carried it along with me, completely forgot it. We camping and crossed the border into Nevada, camped in Nevada, and we were fixing supper and getting straight and camped, went to sleep, and in the middle of the night another boy came and said, so-and-so's sick in the tent, just sick as he can be, you got to do something for him. And I suddenly realized it was the boy that Dad had said. So I got out my little bottle of medicine that he had prescribed already for him before we left on the trip. Gave him 3 teaspoonsful of it, he was all right. Went to sleep, slept right on through the night. Just amazing business of precognition of somebody going to get sick in Nevada over alkali water. And nobody else got sick. We drank the alcohol with the water, and no one else on the trip got sick.
He was just allergic to it.
And he picked this up ahead of time and then gives what to do for it, and then you do it and you got all right, which is it's an interesting kind of ESP. The range of this man was absolutely amazing. Do you remember do you want to talk about any other examples of, clairvoyance or telepathy or anything else in the readings that were unusual to you?
These things that we are picking up are so, they're just sort of things that we haven't concentrated on. That's the reason why I've forgotten them. But remember the beginning of a reading, he mentioned this man's life reading. He mentioned he was going back over the birth date, and often he would do that. He would start with the present day and go right on back to the birth date, and sometimes he would remark on the changes that took place during a certain year.
Yeah.
So, but this time he got all the way back to the birth date, and he said, repeated the birth date, March 10th, 1905, or whatever it was, and said, not a very nice day, is it? Well, about a year or two after Mr. Cayce died, when we were busy trying to get reports in on these last readings that were given, I decided to write to the Weather Bureau in this place where the man was born, and got a report on the weather, and it was really something. Gave the temperature and everything, and how the wind, at a certain time, the wind switched. It was going lickety-split in one direction. All of a sudden, it changed right in the other direction, started going back. And I could see with this baby being born, all these, what it might have caused there with the weather like that.
Yeah.
It was in the summer, I believe.
I have, those things are just so numerous, and they've all been indexed in the readings, and everybody can look them up on Clairvoyance Confirmed kind of things. Do you remember the one that he gave for the man, and he was going back over at the beginning when he was born, and coming forward, and said, Nabisco, Nabisco.
Oh, yeah.
And it was the man wrote us. We didn't understand what Nabisco was about, but the man wrote us.
His wife wrote us.
Almost laughing about it. He said when he was a kid, they began to call him, his name wasn't Nabisco at all, but they began to call him Nabisco because he ate so many Nabisco wafers. And he had this nickname, and the nickname had stuck with him over a period of time, and those were the years where they began to call him Nabisco. In that childhood that he'd picked up this name, in particular name. Gladys, we could just keep talking on and on and on, and we need to stop on this tape, and we'll come back later for another one at another time. We've been talking this afternoon with Gladys Davis Turner about some of the varieties of extrasensory perception that showed in Edgar Cayce's conscious clairvoyance, his conscious ESP abilities, and also many of the strange and unusual little instances of extrasensory perception showing in his psychic readings. We'll come back for another tape with Mrs. Turner at a later date. Thank you very much, Gladys, for this whole session.
Hope everyone enjoyed our presentation from the archives today with Gladys Davis Turner. To learn more, you can check out our website at edgarcayce.org. And on behalf of everyone here at the Association for Research and Enlightenment and moretalk.tv, I hope you have a wonderful week, and thank you so much for tuning in to Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. I'll see y'all next week. And now it's time for the thought for the day here on Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. And joining me, as always, for the thought for the day is Dr. Bill Austin. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today on Reflections.
Hi, Brent. Great to be here. Great to be back with you. Thank you.
Excellent. And if you can go ahead and read the thought for the day this week for our listeners.
I'd be happy to. This thought comes from reading 3420-1. Unless each soul entity makes the world better, that corner or place of the world a little better, a little bit more hopeful, a little bit more patient, showing a little more of brotherly love, a little more of kindness, a little more of long-suffering, by the very words and deeds of the entity, the life is a failure, especially so far as growth is concerned. Though you gain the world, how little you must think of yourself if you lose the purpose for which the soul entered this particular sojourn. Boy, that one can hit you upside of the head, can it?
Absolutely.
It just doesn't seem to coincide with what the world demands of us. Our striving to get ahead, to get it for ourselves or our family, or to conquer this or to conquer that. We're talking about, being kind to one another, to take the situation that we're in, the people that we're dealing with, and spread a little brotherly love, a little understanding, a little bit of patience there. We've talked in the past about cooperation with the divine forces. How do we let that patience, that understanding, that love come through us when we feel like we're being attacked or it's not going right or we're just really struggling? But it really comes down to, we're here to understand ourselves, and one way to understand ourselves is to really see how our relationships with others materialize. It's really a powerful thought.
Absolutely. Yeah, this one is really profound. It's a bit of a long one, but there's a lot packed into this one. You raised a great point in saying that so I think this is so powerful because it's not what we see going on around us, and it's also not what we're told by a lot of influences as we go through our journey. There's this general consensus that as individuals we can be a little powerless sometimes, and I think this is an incredibly empowering thought, and that he talks about, when you think big picture, you think about the billions of people out there, and you always tend to wonder how, as an individual, are we all able to contribute and make a change and make a lasting impact to further our soul growth. And this says it right here, is that it's just all about doing these little things to help people out. And it's all about being selfless. I think we can tend to fall into selfish sort of habits, and this thought in itself can help to pull us out of that. I like the part in the end as well. It says, though you gain the whole world, how little you must think of yourself if you lose the purpose for which the soul entered this particular sojourn. And it shifts our focus towards these little things that we can accomplish every day, these little ways that we can impact people's lives that are constantly, as we've talked about in the past, Bill, presenting themselves for us if we have that selfless mind to recognize it and to dedicate our efforts to helping everyone around us and making, in the littlest ways we can possibly contribute, it's all accounted for. And he stresses the importance in this reading, Cayce does, that this is what we're here for. If you want to know the meaning of life, this in a nutshell tells you what we're here for. It's not about our material pursuits, because he says at the end of the thought, if you think that's what we're here for, just to gain more material goods and make yourself, a more powerful, well-known, serve the ego type path, then you'll find that, it can be empty in the end. It cannot fulfill your soul. We need to find out what we're here for, and we need to bring that love out into the world, and that's what we're really here for.
Yes, well said.
Thank you. Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining us as always on the Thought for the Day. It's always a pleasure having you on.
Oh, it's always great, Brent. Thank you. Have a
Excellent.
great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks. Bye-bye.